Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Brzee with AHRI. We are going to get started with this webinar in just a minute. Thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Chris Brzee with AHRI. Thank you all for joining today for our presentation from the Circular Action Alliance on Extended Producer Responsibility Law Implementation. The Circular Action Alliance, or CAA, was founded by 20 companies from the food, beverage, consumer goods, and retail industries in response to the passage of EPR laws in California, Colorado, Maine, and Oregon. It is the first producer responsibility organization approved to administer an EPR program for paper and packaging in the U.S., and it's seeking to be the approved PRO in all states that have enacted EPR laws for paper and packaging. John Hite from the Circular Action Alliance joins us today and will be giving us some more information on implementation and compliance. Thank you so much, John.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christopher. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, everybody else at AHRI. And thank you all. Looking forward to spending the next hour together. I've got about 40 minutes worth of slides. I'll see if I can keep it on the shorter side, and then we can jump to all of your questions. I know this is a complex topic area. For those of you who have been following along, you may have some questions as you get deeper into the content here. For those of you who are just learning about all of this for the first time, it's a lot fast. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. So if you've got any clarifying questions as well, feel free to drop those in the chat at the end. As Chris said, my name is John. I work with Circular Action Alliance. I sit between our regulatory team and our stakeholder engagement and communications teams. My job primarily focuses at CAA on doing this work, on working with producers to help you all understand the requirements here of the state EPR laws, understand what CAA is, what a pro is, and what compliance with these laws is going to look like from a producer standpoint. So I do a lot of trade association presentations like this, but I also run a lot of our internal educational spaces for producers. Would highly encourage all of you to get involved if you believe that you're likely to have obligations here under the statutes. Our legal counsel does ask that I provide this slide before we jump in too far. You're going to hear a lot today about regulatory compliance. You're going to hear a lot of unpacking of state statutes, and especially state statutes that have strict compliance requirements for entities that are designated as obligated under the statute in each state. As such, there's a lot of work here for you all to be doing as potentially obligated producers with your legal counsel. CAA is here to provide guidance, but at the end of the day, we aren't going to be making determinations for producers of who is and who is not an obligated producer. As such, I'll be providing guidance here through this presentation. We will be providing significantly more guidance this summer and into the fall as we bring producers into the organization. But it's really important that you all be working with your legal counsel, because at the end of the day, whether or not you're an obligated producer is between you, your legal counsel, and the state. So with that said, I'm going to do a quick overview of what EPR is for those of you who are new to the term. Hopefully this helps situate you in what we're even talking about here. We'll cover what a producer responsibility organization is, or a pro. That's what CAA is. We'll get into CAA, where we came from, what we're up to, cover off some state updates, and then we'll end with some slides on producer registration and preparedness. What does all of this look like from your perspective, and what should all of you be keeping top of mind as we move through the next couple of years? So to start with, what is EPR? What is a pro? Simply put, EPR is a policy approach that shifts financial responsibility for the recycling or end-of-life management of a product from local governments and taxpayers to the producer. It's a bit of a mouthful, but generally speaking, it means that costs of managing materials, often that means recycling, is shifted from local government or individual residents that might, purchase waste and recycling services from a waste and recycling company. All of those costs are shifted back to the companies that are placing the packaging on the market in the first place. We've got EPR for a number of other types of materials in the US already. So we have EPR laws for paint. We've got EPR laws for mattresses, for pharmaceuticals, for sharps, for electronics. In fact, there are 24 US states that have EPR laws for electronics. So this is by no means a new policy topic or policy area for the US. What is new is EPR for packaging, or packaging and packaging-like items. EPR for paper and packaging specifically require producers to either partially or fully fund the collection, sortation, and processing of the paper, packaging, and packaging-like items that they supply into these states. Now, the exact scope of these laws, what materials are in scope, differs a little bit state to state. And in a couple of slides, I'll map out excuse me. I'll map out exactly what's in scope for each state, or at least a thumbnail sketch of what's in scope in each state, since they do differ between the programs. But really touching in here on this concept of producer, we CAA are still waiting for additional clarity from honestly each of the EPR states about the specific definition of who is the obligated entity. But generally speaking, the entity that is responsible here, producer is a bit of a misnomer. You might think producer means the producer of the packaging. You might think it means producer of the product that's in the packaging. In many instances, the programs are actually trying to obligate the brand owner. Now, sometimes the brand owner is also the brand owner and the manufacturer. In other instances, the brand owner is distinct from the product manufacturer, which is distinct from the packaging manufacturer. So really key, a key litmus test there, and rule of thumb that I've been sharing with producers is, if you are the brand owner for a product that is associated with packaging, pretty likely that you're going to be the obligated entity here. So if you're putting a product on the market, it's got packaging associated with it, and it has a brand that's owned by your company, on the label, on the packaging, in some way associated with what's being sold, you're probably going to be the obligated entity. In some instances, this will pull in retailers. So for private label materials or private label products, those are usually going to be the obligation of the retailer that is selling those private label products. There may be some restaurant responsibility for food serviceware. There may be some obligation for suppliers of food serviceware. In particular, in Oregon, food serviceware suppliers are required to be the obligated entity for food serviceware. That's not as relevant here to this group, but worth noting that there are some differences across the states about how the states are placing that obligation. And then last but not least, if there isn't a brand owner or a licensee of a brand resident in the US, generally the obligation falls to the first importer. So that will be the company that's doing the importing of that product associated with packaging into the US. And that's a bit of a backstop to make sure that at the end of the day, if a brand is located in Finland or Taiwan or somewhere else around the world, products and packaging that are being sold into the US by those companies are still obligated and managed, and not free riding in the system. The way these programs are funded is through fees that are paid by producers on the type and weight of packaging that they supply into the relevant state. And the fees that producers pay are modulated such that such that producers face incentives around design choices. And these incentives are meant to improve recyclability, minimize waste, improve environmental outcomes. Improving environmental outcomes is a bit vague. And frankly, sometimes states might want to see different incentives put in place. So Oregon, for instance, their EPR law is very clear on wanting to incentivize reduced environmental outcomes as measured through life cycle assessments, LCAs. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with LCAs. Alternatively, California is putting a real premium on recyclability. California wants to see packaging recyclable, and their incentives are designed to really push towards recyclability. And there may be instances where the packaging that is lowest impact from a life cycle impact perspective, the way Oregon wants to measure things, might not actually be very recyclable. And in that case, that might distort these fees compared to what California wants to see, where they're really putting a premium on recyclability. Um, you can envision a world where producer responsibility might look like a producer pulling their material back from the market directly. So if you think of the electronics industry, Apple, for instance, Samsung have buyback programs for their cell phones. Generally, that's a really efficient way for those companies to manage the products that they're putting on the market under an electronics EPR law. The company is directly engaging with the consumer and setting up incentives and reducing friction for the consumer to send back that product at its end of life, and then Apple or Samsung or another company can manage it directly. For packaging, it's really hard to envision how that would work, right? We have generally commingled recycling systems in the U.S. That's not exclusive, but it's generally the way that that recyclables are managed. Super difficult to envision how an individual producer is meant to pull their packaging back out of a commingled system. And the commingled system has benefits, right? You have efficiencies of scale, which are really important from a collection perspective. So generally speaking, producers in an EPR for packaging program operate and comply with the law through what's called a producer responsibility organization, or PRO. You'll hear me refer to the PRO, a PRO, throughout the rest of the presentation. That's a producer responsibility organization. Generally, they are producer-led. Generally, they are nonprofit organizations that provide producers with joint compliance services. So you can think of a PRO as a joint compliance entity for producers. And a pro has two primary responsibilities. Looking upstream, the pro is meant to work with producers to help them categorize their packaging data, report that packaging data into the pro, and then the pro develops out a fee schedule that, like I mentioned, is designed and structured such that it incentivizes packaging design change. And then the pro sets up an invoice for each producer based on the type and weight of packaging that they are supplying into the relevant state. And then that invoice is sent to the producer, and the producer sends the funds over to the pro. On the downstream side, the pro works closely with the state agency, with local governments, with waste and recycling companies to design and map out what's called a program plan. And the program plan essentially outlines from soup to nuts how the pro, on behalf of producers, will meet the requirements of the state's EPR law. That program plan, once complete, will go into the state agency. It will be approved, and once approved by the state agency, or revised and then approved. But once approved, that program plan will have the force of law and becomes a de facto regulatory guide. The program plan then is the guide for developing the program, and the program is then funded by producer fees that are collected from producers, like I mentioned. So hopefully that gives you a rough sense here of what EPR is, what a pro is, and how this system at a high level is meant to operate as we dive deeper here into some of the details of what we're actually talking about state to state. Just a quick note here on EPR in the US as it continues to move. The first two state laws to pass in the US were Maine and Oregon. They passed in 2021. The second two states to pass were Colorado and California. They passed in 2022. Very recently, the fifth US state for EPR, Minnesota, passed last week, Tuesday of last week, so just over a week ago. So it's a very new development. We are seeing EPR continue. You can see all of the orange and red and light green here are states where EPR is actively under consideration. There's a lot of action being taken, and I actually don't think this map fully encapsulates all of the states that have EPR for packaging proposals underway. so just a point to keep in mind that things are moving and things are moving quickly here in the EPR space. I will say that CAA, which we'll get into in a second, what CAA is and the role that it's playing. CAA is not an advocacy organization. We aren't involved in pushing for additional EPR laws in additional states. We are here to help producers with compliance in the 3 states that you see in blue so far, although we are very likely to get involved in both Minnesota and Maine and any future states that do pass an EPR for packaging law. So now that you have a sense of what a producer responsibility organization is, what role it plays in the system, and how it helps producers with compliance, Circular Action Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit pro. It was formed directly in response to the passage of the first 4 EPR states, so Maine, Oregon, Colorado, and California. It's the first and so far only pro to be approved in the US for a program. CAA was approved in California and Colorado over the past year, and we were the only pro to submit a program plan in Oregon on April 1st of this year. CAA was also approved to be the single pro in Maryland, but as you can see from this slide, Maryland has not passed an EPR law yet. Maryland has what we're calling pre-EPR, which is essentially a 3-step process. They've selected a pro, CAA. They have formed an advisory board, and that advisory board will be developing out policy recommendations as a group. The advisory board is made up of a diversity of stakeholders, local governments, counties, ENGOs, waste and recycling companies, producers, and then the pro. And that advisory board will be sending policy recommendations to the governor, and the governor will then send those back to the legislature for consideration for passage in the 2025 legislative session. And then the third item in Maryland is that the state agency is conducting what's called a needs assessment. And a needs assessment is an in-depth, essentially a gap assessment of the current capacity of the recycling system in a given state. And the needs assessment really forms the basis for that program plan, which comes later. So the program plan can help fill in the gaps that are identified in the needs assessment. The 20 companies you see on the screen here are the 20 founding members of CAA. They concentrate largely in the food, beverage, CPG, and retail industries, although we've got a couple beauty folks in there. And I will say that these companies represent a really wide range of diversity of packaging types. However, we also recognize that there are a lot of different industries outside of food, bev, CPG, and retail that are impacted here by EPR, which is a primary reason why we're doing all of these presentations for trade associations. We've been in a lot of good contact and partnership with trade associations to make sure that various industries' input and concerns are brought into, our responses to rulemaking processes, for instance, and early planning around our program plans. We recognize that, every industry has its differences and its different elements and might be impacted differently by EPR. We want to be taking that into consideration. Just a quick word here on CAA's structure at a high level. So the organization was structured from the jump in response to the passage of 4 state laws with the goal of creating a single point of compliance for producers. A number of CAA's founding members have a significant amount of experience with Canadian EPR. EPR has existed for packaging in Canada for 30 years now, and I think it's 6 of 9 Canadian provinces have EPR laws in place. As these new provinces have passed EPR laws over the past 30 years, every new province would essentially form a new producer responsibility organization. So after a while, this meant that producers that were selling across provinces in Canada were dealing with a different entity in every province, which just leads to duplication of costs and duplication of services and, to be perfectly honest, a bit of a headache from a producer perspective. So the founding members of CAA really wanted from the jump to create a national services organization at the federal level in the US that would be able to provide that single point of compliance for producers. So, that really looks like a single reporting portal for producers, a single website that you can head to report your packaging, a single organization that you're getting invoices from, a single point to head to, or a single organization to head to with any questions that you may have. And then CAA is also able to interface and provide efficiencies of scale for producers at the national level by trying to harmonize some of the regulatory requirements across states to the extent that we can. So there's some real benefits to CAA being involved in EPR across the states here. But we also recognize that every state is a bit different. And the state recycling systems that exist are different. The state EPR requirements are different. And so we'll be incorporating subsidiary organizations in every state where CAA is approved. And these subsidiary organizations will be the conduit through which the programs are developed, the program plans are developed, and compliance with the state EPR laws takes place. These subsidiary organizations also mean that funds that producers pay into the system are isolated in each state as opposed to being held at the national level, which means if, for instance, knock on wood, there's litigation in Maine, for instance, Oregon's program plan finances aren't on the hook. So with all of that background out of the way, excuse me, I'm going to do a quick overview here, a thumbnail sketch of the different requirements across the 4 states that have had EPR in place for a little while. Obviously recognize that Minnesota is missing from here. We'll be adding that in the next couple of weeks until CA is able to dig deeper into the Minnesota statute. The ink is still drying on that, and we have not quite decided exactly how we're going to move forward. Very likely that we will be stepping forward to apply to be the pro in Minnesota, but we have not added in details here for Minnesota. So focusing on the 4 states that have existing and existing programs and have been in place for a little while. Starting on the left, what materials are in scope? Again, these definitions differ state to state, but all 4 states include single-use packaging. Again, the definitions might not be the same, so very important to refer back to each state statute and the rules to know exactly what is in scope. All 4 states also include some food serviceware. Maine is probably the most limited in terms of what food serviceware is in scope. California, Oregon, and Colorado have distinct definitions of food serviceware. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection has interpreted Maine's statute to include some food serviceware in the definition of packaging, where packaging could be interpreted to include food serviceware, but there isn't a standalone definition of food serviceware in Maine. And then Oregon and Colorado also include printing and writing paper in the scope of their programs. Again, probably not as important for this particular audience, but really important for some companies, especially those that are manufacturing and selling printing and writing paper in bulk. In Oregon and Colorado, both the packaging around the 50 pounds of paper and the 50 pounds of paper itself will be obligated for fees and reporting. In terms of the sectors that are covered, all 4 states include consumer-facing packaging. However, California and Oregon also include business-to-business packaging. This is a really critical expansion and something that's really important for producers to keep in mind in California and Oregon. We're not just talking about packaging that's associated with a product that's sold to a consumer. We are also talking about shipping and transport packaging as well, or packaging that's used to package, raw materials or supplies that are going to another business in California or Oregon. In terms of the general system funding, again, all 4 states require that producers fund the end-of-life management of covered materials. What that looks like in every state is a little bit different. Maine leans heavier into straight reimbursements from producers to local governments for their recycling costs. Oregon also leans into reimbursements, although the state has been a little bit more detailed, and the statute itself is a little bit more prescriptive in terms of how those fees need to be paid and what those fees need to look like. All 4 states require that producers through a pro invest in education and invest in infrastructure developments in the state. But I will also point out that California also includes a $500 million per year plastic pollution mitigation payment made by producers to CalRecycle, which is the state agency overseeing the EPR law in California. Important to note, we get the question a lot, well, is that 500 million, is that the total budget for the program in California? And the answer is no. The program, producers are required to fund the end-of-life management of covered materials. They're required to fund education. They're required to fund infrastructure investments. They're required to fund everything that's in scope for the program. And then, in addition, producers of plastic packaging are required to fund a $500 million per year plastic pollution mitigation fund. So again, another really important point to be made about California there. The payment here in California is made every year for 10 years. So in total, it'll be $5 billion over 10 years. To jump through a couple of quick state updates, I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. I want to make sure that we get to the producer preparedness slides. But just to make a couple comments here on Colorado, we were selected as the pro May 1st of last year, so we've been approved there for over a year now. The first major undertaking in Colorado is that CAA, as the approved pro, was required to conduct a needs assessment, and I explained that that's that gap assessment that gives us a sense of what the current capacity of a given state is. That work was done through a subcontractor that CAA hired in August of last year, and that work wrapped up in January of this year. And that needs assessment now will be the support or be the background upon which the program plan will be built, and that program plan will be sent into CDPHE, the state agency, by February 1st of next year. In California, CAA was selected as the single pro in January of this year. The first major undertaking in California was the rulemaking process that Cal Recycle kicked off in January of last year. They ran a year-long informal rulemaking stakeholder process that CAA was part of. We provided comments and thoughts to Cal Recycle as part of that rulemaking. And then in January of this year, Cal Recycle kicked off their formal rulemaking period. One of the first major steps there was their formal comment period on their draft regs that opened in March and closed May 8th. CAA did provide substantial comments to Cal Recycle on those draft regs, and now we are all in waiting mode as we wait for Cal Recycle to promulgate those rules by January 1st of next year. In Oregon, CAA was selected, in Oregon, we submitted our program plan on April 1st of this year. Oregon does not have a formal pro approval process. Their pro approval is synonymous with program plan approval. So a pro is not approved in Oregon until there's an approved program plan. But CAA was the only pro to submit a program plan. We expect that program plan to be approved sometime in November or December of this year, at which point CAA would be the only pro approved in Oregon. The work underway right now is to revise that program plan through an iterative process over the next couple of months with DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, the state agency there in Oregon, and also working with local governments, working with trade associations, producers, and the waste and recycling industry to flesh out and really begin to build the foundation of that program, even as the program plan is going under a revision process. In Maine, we have not been as engaged with Maine. They don't select a pro until early 2026. The RFP for selecting a pro in Maine is not released until the fall of 2025. So we have been involved in their informal stakeholder workshops last year around their rules and their formal rulemaking process this year, but we've really focused the bulk of our energy on those three Western states. And then I mentioned in Maryland, we were selected as the single pro in October of last year, and our primary role in Maryland is participating in that advisory board. And the first advisory board, actually, the first meeting happened this morning. So I gave a short version of this presentation to the advisory board there in Maryland, and that group will meet, I think, on a 6-week rolling basis through the fall. All right, so with about 10, 12 minutes here, hopefully we can get through some of the producer preparedness and registration considerations. I think this is the stuff that's going to be really top of mind for all of you as we move through the next couple of years. We have put this slide together that gives you a sense at a high level of like, what are the boxes of requirements that producers need to keep top of mind, and where do those boxes land? In all 4 states, and I'll also softly include Minnesota in here because these requirements are also going to be applicable in Minnesota as well. Producers are required to join unapproved pro. Generally speaking, there's going to be 1 pro in each state. So far, CAA is the only approved pro in Colorado and California. Will probably be the only pro in Oregon. And at the outset, Minnesota only allows for 1 pro as well, as does Maine. So pretty likely you'll be dealing with 1 entity across each of the states. It's really important that you join that entity early if you believe that you're likely to have obligations here so that you can start preparing. And you're really preparing your data. You're starting to prepare your packaging data for reporting. This is not a simple undertaking. I have heard from a couple of consultant service providers that provide reporting and data management services to CPG companies, food and beverage companies, and others that have EPR requirements, that it can take 4 to 6 months internally to get your data prepared. That's a pretty long time frame. So the earlier you're able to get involved and start to prepare your data and understand your role sort within your company to manage this compliance work, the better you'll be, better off you'll be. Once you've joined the pro, collected your data, then you need to report that data to the approved pro. The pro then takes in producer data, develops out that fee schedule, sends out invoices to all of the producers, and then producers pay those fees or dues into the pro. The fourth bucket here isn't exactly a requirement per se. It's more, it's tied into those incentives that I was talking about. The fee schedule will be incentivizing design change within packaging. You don't have to take advantage of those incentives, but you probably want to take advantage of those incentives. So while design change, rethinking through your delivery models isn't a requirement, it is something that you as a company are probably going to want to start to think about and be working closely with either your subcontractors or with your packaging engineering team. Lastly, there are two buckets, one of which pertains to California and Maine, one of which only pertains to California. Starting with the first, both California and Maine have an element of source reduction in them. It's most clearly spelled out in California what this needs to look like. California's SB 54 is requiring that by 2032, producers source reduce 25% of their plastic packaging. Really key to underline plastic packaging there. SB 54 applies to all types of packaging generally, but the source reduction requirements in SB 54 only apply to plastic packaging. What do we mean by source reduction? Source reduction is broken down in the statute into a couple of actions. No less than 10% of that source reduction by 2032 may come from reuse and refill, switching to reuse and refill, or outright reduction of packaging. And that really means eliminating packaging altogether, moving from a box of a box around a bar of shampoo, for instance, to just selling the shampoo bar. That would be outright elimination. No more than 8% of the source reduction can come from increased use of post-consumer recycled content in your packaging. And then the delta between those two is 7%, which can come from lightweighting and right sizing and other actions like that. Really important to note as well for this 25% source reduction requirement. This is not a requirement on each and every individual producer. So not every one of you as a company will need to switch 10% of your packaging to reuse and refill, increase your recycled content in 8% of your packaging, and lightweight and right size the rest. This is a market-wide requirement. So it will be up to CAA working with producers to figure out exactly how to meet the source reduction requirements across all types of plastic packaging. We are currently working through with the state agency. We're working through individually within our organization, and we're starting to talk through with producers what that would look like. But again, another really important reason to stay close to CAA as we move through this process. And then lastly, in California, producers are required by 2032 to ensure that 100% of their packaging is either recyclable or compostable. In my opinion, this is kind of the sleeping dragon within EPR in California, that I think a lot of folks really focus on the source reduction, and they don't focus as much on this 100% recyclable, 100% compostable requirement. Compostability and recyclability in California are terms that are tied to other existing statutes. So for compostables, that's AB 1201, which is the compostable labeling law. And for recyclables, it's all other packaging. It's SB 343. Within SB 343, there's some pretty strict requirements about access to recycling for different types of material that determine whether or not a material is considered recyclable or not. And for some materials, meeting that recyclable standard by 2032 is going to be a pretty high bar. And CAA is already working to map out the gap between where we are today and where Some of these materials need to be by 2032, but the ultimate sort of stick within SB 54 is that if a particular material class is not considered recyclable by 2032, it can be subject to a ban by Cal Recycle. So really important to keep an eye out there. Just want to give you all a quick sense here of the timelines that we're talking about for these three Western state programs. Anything you see in green is a statutory requirement. Anything you see in blue is a CAA preliminary deadline. I do put preliminary in all caps at the top of the screen because these dates may be subject to change. We have already shifted them around a little bit. We are working with fluid rulemaking processes in each state, and as such have to shift our timelines a bit as things change. But we really think it's important to give you all a sense of what the next 3 years look like. So starting on the left here, the first major step is to register with CAA. We have set a deadline of July 1st of this year, so just 5 weeks away for producers to register. I'll get into some details on that on the next slide. It takes about a minute and a half. It's a very straightforward process, but it is really critical so that we understand who's out there and which producers believe that they're likely to have obligations here. Once you register, we can start helping you prepare for the next major deadline, which is a March 2025 reporting deadline in Oregon. By March 31st of next year, producers will need to report their first year's worth of data to CAA. So it's really critical that producers are inside the organization and starting to prepare because, again, like I said, this can take 4 to 6 months to prep your data. So this isn't something you can skip in on, March 20th and expect that you're going to be able to whip up your data and get that reported. It takes time. In terms of the fee schedules, we are anticipating having a draft preliminary fee schedule in our resubmitted program plan in Oregon in September of this year, so about 4 months from now. But given the fact that the fee schedule is dependent on producer data, we aren't going to have a final fee schedule in Oregon until after producers report their data in March. And then that program launches in July of next year. So a really tight timeline here. We're working on condensed timelines. This is just the way that things are shaking out with the statutory structure. So again, really important that you stay close to us, that you register so that we can make sure that we're getting you as much information as we possibly can on time. In Colorado and California, the reporting deadline is going to be August of 2025 for both states. We anticipate releasing our fee schedule in Colorado in October of 2025, and then that program launches in January of 26. And then in California, we anticipate releasing our fee schedule in April of 26, and then launching that program in January of 27. So a little bit more time in Colorado and a bit more time than that in California. In terms of producer registration, to dial in here a bit on this requirement, you can head into our website through this QR code here. It'll take you to our registration form that you can fill out. Like I said, it takes about a minute and a half. It's a very quick process. At this point, there's no cost for producers to register with CAA. And really important to add, we get the question a lot, if I register with CAA, is this locking me in to, EPR requirements forever and always? No, you're not signing your company up for EPR fees for eternity by registering with CAA. This is essentially a contact form that lets us know who you are and that you believe that you may have obligations under a couple state laws, or just one state law. If that's the case, then eventually, yes, you will have fee obligations. You will need to pay into the program as an obligated producer. But if it turns out down the road that you don't actually have obligations under one or several state laws, that your company does not meet the definition of obligated producer, then your registration status changes and you're off to the races. These laws are they have very specific definitions of who the obligated entity is, and if your company does not meet that definition, then you're not obligated. But given the importance of starting to prepare if you are likely to be obligated here, we really are encouraging producers to register as soon as possible ahead of that July 1st, 2024 registration deadline. We've also gotten the question a lot about who within my company should register with CAA. Should it be sustainability? Should it be finance? Should it be legal? Should it be GR? At the end of the day, it's up to your company and your structure. I would say the job description is someone who's able to bring compliance communications and compliance steps quickly and easily within the company and to pull from the company the relevant employee, the relevant lead on specific compliance steps back into communication with CAA. So that might be somebody in your legal department. That might be somebody in your GR department. It might be somebody in your sustainability department, but ultimately it should be somebody who can pull on, a packaging engineer or a legal counsel or, the C-suite or, GR at a, in a fairly quick manner. That's really who I think will find the most success with being that primary contact for compliance with EPR here. And then very lastly, before we get to my last slide and get to your questions, we are developing guidance materials. I know this was a ton of information, super fast. We get a lot of clarifying questions from producers during Q&A and during some of our internal educational webinars as well. We will be mapping all of this out in excruciating, gut-wrenching detail. By the end of the summer and into the fall, we'll be putting together a guidebook for producers that will map out scenarios in each state to help producers identify whether or not they are likely to meet the definition of obligated producer, that will map out the reporting categories for producers, that will map out reporting processes. We'll start to facilitate introduction for producers to our reporting portal. There's a lot that's coming later this summer and into the early fall. Our IT team has started to develop out the reporting portal. We anticipate that will launch well ahead of the March 31st, 2025 reporting deadline in Oregon, and our hope is to start in familiarizing producers with that portal this fall. We have a ton of resources on our website. Please head to our website, take a look at our FAQs. We've got breakdowns of each state statute. We also have a monthly newsletter that producers can sign up for, where we try and pump out as much information as we possibly can to all of you on the goings-on in each state. And then critically, we also have our producer working group, which is our internal it's our internal educational space for producers. Once a month, we host a webinar where we dive deep on different topics. This upcoming webinar on June 11th, we will be deep diving on the California requirements that I talked through, that source reduction requirement and the 100% recyclable, 100% compostable requirement. We leave lots of time for your questions. That space will only be open starting June 11th to registered producers. So really important that you do your analysis here. Take a look through the state statutes, determine whether or not you are likely to have an obligation. If you believe that you're likely to be obligated, go ahead and register with CAA. Like I said, it takes about a minute and a half, and then we'll get you signed up for that producer working group, and you can continue to build your brain on what all of this looks like. I'd also say and I can drop this in the chat once I stop talking here. We also are hosting weekly onboarding sessions for producers. These are essentially a condensed version of this presentation with about 35 minutes for questions and answers. We're running that on a weekly basis. I'd say, to those of you on this call, you've just gotten the presentation that you'll get. But if you think that this would be really helpful for others in your organization, you can obviously share the recording here with others in your companies. But if they've got questions and want to, ask their questions live with me and others on our team, those are a great resource for doing that. So here's our contact information. Please feel free to send us an email as well. Follow us on social. Yeah, I think we've got about maybe 10, 12 minutes for some questions. I see we've got 5 in the chat, Chris.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation. To kick us off here, since I know we only have a few minutes, the first question I have, is there split responsibility for products sold on a third-party marketplace in which that marketplace adds additional packaging that the manufacturer does not have control over, for example, Amazon?
Yes, there is. There's split responsibility. Most of the states approach it that so if there's a product, let's say, not to pick on any products in particular, but let's say it's a pair of shoes, and you've got a box around those pair of shoes, and you've got tissue paper in the box with the pair of shoes. If that is a major sneaker manufacturer, the major sneaker manufacturer is going to be obligated for the box and the tissue paper. If that then is sent to an e-commerce platform, and the e-commerce platform then sends it out the door with packaging that is around that shoebox, whether or not it has the e-commerce platform's brand name on it, that's going to be the obligation of the e-commerce platform. So there is split responsibility there.
The next question is, what data is needed to report? Will it likely be the same data for each state?
No, it isn't. Sorry, I'm multitasking. I'm putting the onboarding session link in the chat there. It is not going to be the same for each state, and that is just the discrepancies between the different states, primarily driven by the fact that in California, the state agency Cal Recycle is statutorily required to develop the reporting categories. There are 94 reporting categories currently that Cal Recycle has developed. Those are likely to be the final promulgated reporting categories, and those are going to be finalized before July 1st of this year. CAA is able to develop the reporting categories in Oregon and Colorado. We are aiming for 62 reporting categories in Oregon. Those are more or less maps to the California categories, hopefully cutting some fluff where we can. And we expect the reporting categories in Colorado to look fairly similar to the reporting categories in Oregon. But those reporting categories also have to be responsive to the different needs and different requirements within each statute. So where those differ between the states, those reporting categories might look a little bit different. As you ask the next question, Chris, I can try and pull up we've got a link here to both of the different reporting category lists for California and Oregon, and I can try and drop those in the chat.
Thanks. Yeah, the next question is, has the fee structure for California, Oregon, or Colorado been released?
No. All right, sorry, I'm walking and chewing gum at the same time. So there's California's reporting list, and then let me just do Oregon really quickly. Oregon. The reporting categories are on pages 99 to 100 of the document I just put in the chat there. We don't have fee schedules yet. Unfortunately, fee schedules really can't be developed in any state until we have a sense of how much packaging producers are supplying into a given state. So this comes back to the critical importance of producers registering by July 1st. If we don't have clear producer information and clear producer data, it's really tough for us to set accurate fees. We were required by statute to provide a preliminary, and I do mean super underscore italicized, all capital letters, preliminary fee schedule in Oregon. You can find that as part of the program plan that I just dropped in the chat. That will give you a really rough, blindfolded, throw a dart at a dartboard estimate of what we think the fees will be across 8 aggregated material categories. Keep in mind that those 8 aggregated material categories will be broken out into a fee schedule that maps to the 62 reporting categories in Oregon. We anticipate releasing that fee schedule in Oregon, like I said, in September of this year, along with our revised program plan. But again, that fee schedule might change a little bit as we move through producer reporting after that March 31st reporting deadline in Oregon. The other states then have fee timelines that are pushed out a bit more. Like I said, I think Colorado is going to be October of 2025, and we anticipate releasing a fee schedule in California in April of 26.
Awesome. The next question is, a member stating that they're still trying to wrap their head around if they're an obligated producer or not. They say that they're a smaller company without dedicated legal counsel, and they're asking where they can get started and if there's a tool or anything to work through determining if they're an obligated producer or not.
It's a good question. Our guidebook later this summer will hopefully be that tool. It's going to have all the different details across the different states and the different requirements mapped out. I don't want to get ahead of myself and spoil anything, but we are batting around ideas like trying to create are you a producer software wizard where you can click through a set of questions and it'll tell you at the end whether or not you're likely to have obligations. Again, keeping in mind that CAA isn't going to be telling producers whether or not they have obligations. We will just be giving guidance here. But I would say that the guidebook at the end of the summer, early fall is the best bet. And like I said, if you believe that you may have obligations, but you're not entirely sure, go ahead and register, join our producer working group. And if it turns out down the road that you don't have obligations for whatever reason, then, you're on your way. But better that than sitting around in the dark wondering what's happening. I'd also say that if you really are a very small company, There are de minimis exemptions within each of the state's statutes. They differ a little bit state to state, but generally we're talking about companies that are smaller than $5 million in gross annual revenue, and that's gross annual revenue across the whole company, not gross annual revenue in state. Or I should say, so either 5 million in gross annual revenue or a company that is supplying less than 1 ton of packaging into a given state, into an EPR state. So if that description fits your company, you may actually just be wholly exempt from requirements under the statute.
The next question is, if a company has multiple legal entities, do they register with CAA at the parent company level or for each individual legal entity?
Great question. Parent company. Parent company.
Awesome.
Yep.
So we also had a question from a member stating, I know this discussion has focused on packaging EPR. Is CAA working at all with states that are considered refrigerant producer responsibility organizations?
Another great question, Eric. No, we are not. At this point, we are just focused on packaging. We get this question a fair amount because, there's a lot of intersection here for the electronics sector between packaging and electronics EPR, for the paint sector between paint and, paint packaging, for your sector between refrigerants and packaging. We are just focusing on packaging. I don't have a crystal ball to stare into and tell you what CAA will be doing in 10 years, but for now I can tell you that we're just focusing on packaging.
Also asked was if there will be a standardized reporting template that manufacturers can use.
Yes. Still under development, but yes.
Okay. Is the de minimis rule applicable at the legal entity level or parent company level?
Great question. I'm going to take that back internally. I'm not actually sure of the answer, 100% certain, but I believe it would be parent. At the subsidiary would be a loophole that I think every state would probably want to plug.
Okay. Is there activity considering EPR for products themselves? I think you kind of answered that rather than just the packaging. But are you aware of any broader programs?
Besides the existing programs, no. There are refrigerant EPR programs that are cropping up. There are EPR programs for solar panels and EV batteries that are on the horizon. There's, a EPR for textiles that's on the horizon. Like there's a lot of different sectors and material types that are in the crosshairs for EPR legislation. But again, CAA is not an advocacy org. We're just a compliance organization. So, we're tracking, especially what's happening in the packaging EPR development space, or what's developing in the packaging EPR space. There we go. But we aren't like leaning in to heavy analysis of other types of EPR. That's for, other industries and trades and producers.
Understood. And then lastly, very, very quickly, because I know you're up against time. If a parent company is a foreign entity, should the US entity register or the global corporate parent?
That's a really, really good question. Let me take that back internally, Christopher, and I can shoot you an email. And maybe you can include that answer in your follow-up with this deck. Yep. And reporting to the members here. Nicholas, that's a really good question. I'm not even going to answer. I'm gonna check internally and get back. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, John, for your time and for your presentation today. We'll definitely be following up with members with materials from this presentation, as well as if any questions went unanswered or if you have any follow-up questions for the members, we're happy to coordinate. But thank you again, John, so much for your time, and hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thanks all.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.